I knock very loudly because I was very angry. So, yeah, I don't know. I feel like it was on her to get away.
Welcome to another episode of the Nerds You're Looking For podcast, a weekly nerd culture podcast that discusses nerddom through various segments. You can find us at thenerdspodcast.com, and you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter through our handle at thenerdspodcast. If you'd like to reach us directly, including sending us suggestions for our nerd favorite segment, you can email us at thenerdsyou'relooking4@gmail.com. Additionally, we have a YouTube page under the Nerds You're Looking For banner, and each of us also have a Letterboxd, which is basically social media for watching movies. On Letterboxd, I'm at that Tyler Hunt, and my co-host Pat can be found at the Nerds Podcast. With all of that being said, and without further ado, alongside me, as always, is my co-host, Pat Attack. How's it going, man?
Every episode, I think, oh, he's not going to say Pat Attack. And then every episode you say Pat Attack, and I'm like, fuck. Like, eventually I assume that you're going to forget about it, and it's just going to, like, fade away, like a lot of things that we used to do that we don't do anymore on the podcast. And every episode I am, like, slightly disappointed. Like, a little piece of me dies every time you say Pat Attack.
You want to know what's funny is, so last time I did the intro, you pointed out that it was pretty good, and I said, yeah, it's amazing what you can do when you write things down. And what's funny is in my little spiel that I have written down now for when I do the intro, at the end of it, I make sure to say my co-host Pat Attack. So I will never forget ever again.
You should change me in your contacts in your phone to Pat Attack.
It's just weird that I'm the only person embracing it. So, I mean, if
there's other people that now call me Pat Attack that listen to this podcast now. So I curse your name every so often when somebody calls me Pat Attack.
My work here is done.
Everything's good, man. We're getting closer to Halloween, which is always exciting. I had an interesting week. I almost had to call the cops on my neighbor, so that's always fun. I don't know if you've had to experience that before, but it's not a great feeling. I didn't end up having to call the cops on them, but I did have to have like the awkward like walk over to their house to knock on their door. It was so basically, I'll just tell the story. I don't know why I was being super vague about it. But basically, I went and saw Halloween, which we're going to review. And I saw it Thursday night. And so I got home kind of late. Like, I have to work early in the morning on the weekdays. So like 9:30. Me getting home from a movie at like 9:30 is kind of late. But I got home, and my neighbor is like blasting music. And I'm just like, whatever, it's 9:30. Like, it's for me, that's kind of like when I'm starting to wind down, get ready to go to bed. But for normal people that don't have to be up at 5:30 in the morning, like, that's really not that late. So I try to be a little bit more understanding when it comes to stuff like that. Like, my late is not always everybody else's late. So I'm just like, whatever. And so I walk into the house. I mean, there's a Thursday night football game, so I'm going to watch the end of that anyway, so it's not a big deal. But my wife had been sick the last couple of days, and so I went in there because she was already laying down. And I was like, hey, like, do you need me to say something to them? Like, she's like, no, don't worry about it. Don't make it a thing. And so I watched the end of the game, and I turned the TV off, and it's still like blasting. Like, I'm sitting in my living room and I can sing along to the song. Like, that's how loud it is. Like, it's ridiculous. I would never do that because I'm tone deaf and I'm a terrible singer, but I could. Like, I knew what song it was. And so I kind of went outside and just to kind of like check it out. And I walk over there, and it's not even their house. It's coming from their car. Like, their car is parked in their driveway, just blasting music. And I was like, that's kind of a weird way to do that. But again, it's like 10:15, so it's still not that late. And so I get back in the house, and I kind of just hang out, watch, I think, something. I think I was watching the Big Mouth or something. It doesn't matter. And then 11 o'clock rolls around and I can still hear the music and I'm like, fuck, I need to go to sleep. And so I go back out there and I have to walk over there and like knock on their door. And at this point, I'm pretty pissed. And so I knock on their door like 3 or 4 times. I don't even know if they were home. Like, that's the weird thing, because they never answered. Never once answered. And so I was just like, fuck this. Like, either I'm going to shut their radio off in their car or I'm going to call the cops. So I just opened up their Jeep and just shut off their radio and then walked into my house.
Wow.
Yeah. So I was pretty pissed. Like, I even, like, when I got in my house, I was kind of seeing red at this point, and I have a bit of a temper, as you probably know, Tyler. So I was like, I'm going to write these motherfuckers a note and leave it on their Jeep. And then I was like, no, that's not a good idea.
So I have a few questions, and my first question doesn't mean anything to our listeners, that have not ever been to your house, which I'm assuming is most of our listeners. But, which neighbor?
100% of our listeners. Well, no, Jeff's been to my house, of course.
That's why I didn't say 100%, because I knew Jeff listens and he's been to your house. But which neighbor was it?
It was the neighbor, like, if you're walking into my house, it's the neighbor to the left, which...
You've told me before that they're weird people.
Well, no, well, yeah, they are. When we first moved in, there was a family that was super weird that lived in the house, and I don't know if that family owns it or who owns it, but they're renters. Like, so we've had 2 or 3 families that have lived in that same house since we've lived in our house, and we've only lived in our house for like 4 years. So it's pretty quick turnaround. The people that lived there the last time were pretty cool. Like, I talk to the guy every once in a while, as much as I talk to my neighbors. I'm not really that guy that talks to my neighbors, but for the most part, I mean, I would chit chat with him every once in a while. He was a pretty cool guy. And then these new people just moved in, and within a couple of months, I'm turning off their car stereo. So yeah, it's not a great start for them.
Yeah, I mean, I've never had to call the cops on my neighbor. The closest I ever got was whenever I lived in Evansville. I mean, you were at my house quite a few times. Like, I lived on a cul-de-sac, but it was like a tale of 2 halves of the cul-de-sac. So there was like the half that had houses that were not bad, which is the house the section I lived in. And then there was the other half of the cul-de-sac that were all duplexes. And not that there's anything wrong with a duplex, but some of the people that lived in these duplexes were less than savory characters, we could say. And the people so my house was next to a duplex, and the half of the duplex that was nearest to my house at one point, the people that lived there whenever we first moved into our house were really white trash. And every once in a while they'd spill out into their driveway yelling at each other. So I never had to call the cops on that, but I got close a couple times because it got a little violent. But like you, I don't really talk to my neighbors, so I kind of just was gossipy about it with my wife, but then left them to their devices. So
yeah, you get that every once in a while in Evansville. Before we bought the house that we currently live in, we used to live in a townhouse, and it's always kind of a mixed bag when you live somewhere like that in Evansville, because we would have like super old people that are obviously retired, don't need a full house. And then you have people like us that were kind of cool, younger people that, well, I don't know if I necessarily describe myself as cool, but I mean, younger couples that aren't quite ready for houses. But then you just have the white trash douchebags in Evansville that just can't afford to have a house. And this is kind of like the closest that they can have. And so, yeah, I've definitely experienced that. I never really had any run-ins. Like, this is the worst run-in I've had with neighbors before, other than like in college where you just have like a bunch of parties and shit.
Yeah. So that's interesting. I wonder how the music even got left on that loud and they didn't notice, or
it's a fucking mystery. So my wife and I are actually convinced that they have died and they're just dead in that house, because we haven't seen them since. The Jeep hasn't moved since. I don't know. I'm like very curious to like walk up and see if the keys are still in the car, like just to see if they've even left that spot, because it was very weird. Like, how do you fall asleep? Like, I literally could hear it in our house. That's how loud it is. Now, granted, our house is not very far away, but how do you fall asleep with that music that loud? Like, I just, there's so many questions that I want to ask these people if they're still alive.
So I have two theories. So the first is that they're on drugs and they nodded out. The second is that it's exactly what you said, and they're dead. But I imagine you're the character in the horror movie. So while they were inside getting murdered by a serial killer, you came to the door and there was like a glimpse of hope that you were going to save them. But really you were just pissed off about the music and you ended up leaving. And then the girl gets her throat slashed as soon as you walk away. So that's the other alternative to what probably happened.
That's the only reasonable explanation to what happened, is that I'm that douchebag in the horror movie that while you're watching the movie, you're yelling like, just walk in, like, just help her. Yeah, I was definitely that guy. No, it's on her because I knocked 3 times. I knocked very loudly because I was very angry. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like it was on her to get away and answer the door real quick, and then I would have helped her out. I actually probably wouldn't have helped her. I probably would have ran her away like a little bitch. But like, I was actually thinking the other way, like they were murdered and now my fingerprints are in that Jeep.
Yeah, you might be fucked, man.
Yeah, I might be, might have the cops called on me here in a little bit, but, we might have like a swatting incident while we're recording the podcast. But, so yeah, this is an interesting conversation, but if this is your first episode, we don't normally start off the episodes by talking about this kind of stuff. We kind of just shoot the shit for a little bit and then get right into the episode. We break up these episodes into segments, and we call the first segment, what we're into. We've been doing something a little bit different, it being October, and we do Shocktober, where we watch a horror movie every day of October. So instead of just being into whatever we've watched recently, we've actually been recapping our week in Shocktober. So how'd you do this week?
So I'm doing pretty good. I mean, I know that whenever we define Shocktober, we say it's a horror movie every day, but I've pretty much gotten to the point where I go into the month knowing that there are going to be days where I can't watch a movie. So I've defined it as myself for 31 horror movies in 31 days. And as of this morning, I am caught up, which is pretty cool. I think this is the best Shocktober I've ever had, if I'm being honest, because in years past, I've had to count things like episodes of American Horror Story or episodes of horror TV shows and kind of cheat a little bit. But this year I'm 21 for 21, which is a pretty good feeling. But last week I did have to catch up a little bit. So I'll just kind of start with the movie I watched last Sunday. And that movie was called Demonic. And it's a piece of shit, as most horror movies tend to be. But it's basically about a police officer and a psychologist investigating the deaths of 5 people who were killed while trying to summon ghosts, according to IMDb. I watched this on Amazon Prime. It stars Maria Bello and Frank Grillo. And like I said, it's awful. So I don't really have much more to say about it. I mean, things kind of pick up at the end, but it's just this weird, poorly made movie. So I would not waste your time on that. I can't even remember how I stumbled across it. I think it was one of those best horror movies streaming right now lists, and it just wasn't great. But my wife likes those kind of movies, so she watched that with me, and she hated it as well. So that being said, Monday, I believe it was, I had to do a palate cleanse. And so I watched the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which, I mean, we've talked about tons on this podcast. I mean, it was on your top 10. It's become one of my favorite movies over the last few years. So love it to death. I might watch it again this month because this is the prime season for the Rocky Horror Picture Show, but just love it. Listening to the soundtrack right now. Great stuff. That same day, to catch up a little bit, I also watched You're Next, which was the first time I've watched that movie since we saw it in theaters, believe it or not. And it holds up. It holds up just like it did in theaters. It's still a great movie. I love the cast in that movie, and I forget the actress's name who plays the main, femme fatale, but she's great. And it's a really cool kind of flip on the slasher genre, which I definitely appreciate. The next day, I watched Truth or Dare, and you may be saying to yourself, Tyler, why did you watch Truth or Dare? I talked about it earlier this year and what I was into, and talked about how shitty it was. And I think
one of the worst movies I've seen this year.
Yeah. So I was like, well, it's still a Blumhouse movie, and I've seen all the Blumhouse movies that are horror films, and so I might as well just watch it. Here's the fucking kicker, man. So it says Truth or Dare is on Netflix from 2017. So I get my years mixed up and I'm like, oh, it's the Blumhouse movie from April. And it is not. It is a TV movie from 2017 that is basically the same exact premise, but I'd imagine even worse than the Blumhouse version of it.
Impossible.
I don't know. I'd be curious. Like, you should watch it and you should do a comparison, or maybe I'll just watch the Blumhouse version and I can. But I got about half an hour into it and I'm like, where's the main girl from this movie that was in the trailers? And so I look it up on IMDb and realize halfway through the movie, I'm not watching the right fucking movie. So it was just a whole ordeal. And at the end of the day, there were actually some decent moments in it. But I mean, it's not a good movie by any stretch of the imagination. So it was just really fucking weird to me that these movies came out in such close proximity, and that they're both terrible, and that this was the one on Netflix. And it's funny, I was looking at like a message board for this movie, and people were saying how they accidentally watched this instead of the 2018 version because it's on Netflix right now. So I'm not alone, but it was definitely a little surreal. The next day, my wife and I watched Jigsaw. Never saw that whenever it came out, I believe last year. I actually don't even think I finished the Saw franchise whenever it was going pretty strong there, like a movie every year. But, you know, I like the first couple installments of that franchise, so we decided to give Jigsaw a go. And at this point, like, there were decent kills and the story wasn't awful. But by the time that it gets to the end of the movie and it's time for like the patented Saw twist, like, they've just made this timeline of Jigsaw killing so convoluted that it takes them like 15 minutes to even explain what's going on and who's working with who and when this movie takes place, that it's just a bit silly at this point. Like, I went through and I made my top 25 horror movies of all time list on Letterboxd yesterday, and Saw is on it, the original Saw, and it's up there pretty high. And I stand by that because I love that movie and I love the twist in that movie, but they've just completely built like this weird thing around it with these other timelines and what they've done with the sequels to try to throw twists in every movie, and it's just become this mess. But I mean, I do stand by that first one being good. But yeah, Jigsaw's not great. The next night, my wife and I decided to go see a horror movie. This would have been Thursday because I wanted to see Halloween, but I wanted to watch the original Halloween before seeing it. So instead of seeing Halloween Thursday night, we saw Hellfest, which is another movie you talked about on the podcast. But my wife wanted to see it, needed to watch a horror movie, so we went for it. It would, honestly, I don't think that it was as bad as you said it was, but it's definitely not great. Like, I'd give it a 2.5 out of 5, so just shy of recommending it. I thought it was a fun slasher movie in parts, and other parts of it were just so incredibly unbelievable that you just couldn't stand it. That being said, my wife hated it, but I loved the last shot of the movie, which I won't spoil because obviously this is still a film in theaters. You're shaking your head because you don't like it, I guess. But
Nope.
I like, it's not really a twist, but I like that let's just say the identity of the killer doesn't really matter. So I kind of like that aspect of it. The next night, like I said, I wanted to watch the OG Halloween before seeing the new one that we're reviewing today. So watched that Friday night. And I mean, obviously it holds up. It's my favorite horror movie of all time. One of the greats. Love it to death. Nothing more to say there. I'm sure we'll touch on that movie a little bit whenever we get to our review. And then yesterday afternoon, so Saturday afternoon, I watched obviously the movie we're reviewing. So the new Halloween, which can't really say much now because we're going to review it later. And then the movie that got me caught up. So I watched 2 yesterday. My wife and I watched Hereditary yesterday evening, which was the first time I've watched that since theaters. My wife has not seen it. I told my wife, you will not like this movie. She still wanted to see it. We had a fight after it was over because of the movie, because she looked at me and she goes, you like that? And that set me off a little. Like, it wasn't like a serious fight, but it was like, dude, I told you wouldn't like this movie. And here we are watching this movie. And then you call me basically stupid for liking this movie. And it was just a whole ordeal. But that movie holds up. It's not a movie that I'll watch a lot because it is draining and it lingers with you for a couple days afterwards. But I still enjoy it. I still think that it's a great horror film. So that was week 3 for me.
So before we got into Shocktober this year, we did our Shocktober preview, which is an episode that we do every year. and I kind of monopolized the conversation. I had a lot of stuff planned, and I kind of made Tyler look like a little bitch. But with these, what we're into, where we kind of recap it every week, this is the worst Shocktober I've ever had. And so Tyler's kind of, that has kind of reversed, because Tyler's making me look like a bitch. I don't have much to talk about with my Shocktober recap. It was kind of a lackluster week for me, but I also included, we recorded a little bit later last week than we normally do, and I talked about every movie I had seen up until we recorded. So last week was kind of heavy for me, and then this week not so much. So I only have 3 that I want to talk about. I actually saw Halloween twice this week, and so of course those were my Shocktober viewings for those days. So we're going to be reviewing that in a little bit. So obviously I'm not going to talk about that. So yes, I only have 3 that I talked about, but I actually watched a movie every day this week. The first movie that I watched after we recorded was The Ritual, which is a movie that Tyler talked about last week that sounded really, really interesting. It's a movie that I'd been wanting to see for a while now. It is definitely one of those movies on the best horror movies to stream right now lists. I see it all the time pop up on those lists. So I wanted to check it out, and you had talked pretty positive about it last episode, so I wanted to check it out. And honestly, it definitely gave me vibes from The Descent. It felt like somebody watched that movie and was like, hey, that was an amazing movie, which it is. Let's try to make a movie kind of similar to that. And so I really appreciate that. I kind of it's funny that you talked about Truth or Dare, because I feel the same way about that movie. Like somebody watched It Follows and made just a shittier version of that movie. It felt like The Ritual, somebody watched The Descent and made a pretty decent homage type of movie to that movie. And so I definitely appreciate that. I will say that the monster at the end, I was kind of disappointed at first, because they definitely hide it for a while, which makes sense for a lower budget horror movie. You don't want to waste a lot of your special effects budget early on in the movie. And I've talked about this before. Once you show the monster a lot, or the ghost, or whatever it is, it kind of loses its power in horror movies. So I think that they did a really good job of kind of delaying that as long as they physically possibly could. I will say that my wife and I were watching this movie, and I kind of made a comment that it kind of looks like a tree vagina, the first time you see it. But eventually you get more and more a little, I guess, mythology to the creature, and then you see it, it kind of essentially shows its almost like its evolved form at the end, and it looks really cool. So I will give it credit. It kind of looked silly at the very beginning, but then you see it in its, I guess, in its true form later on in the movie, and it's actually pretty cool. So I would definitely give The Ritual 3 stars, maybe 3.5 if I watched it again and it holds up. So I definitely think that it's a good movie for sure. And definitely, again, if you like The Descent, you will like this movie for sure. And then I actually doubled up that night and we watched Hold the Dark, which I was kind of going back and forth about if I was going to count it for Shocktober or not, because I wasn't sure if it necessarily fit. But I've been wanting to watch this movie for a while, and it was kind of my excuse to watch it. Was hey, I'm going to definitely count this. I don't want to say that it's a murder mystery, because it's really not a mystery. You know who does the murders pretty early on in the movie. It is a Jeremy Saulnier movie, which he did Blue Ruin. He also did Green Room, which I am a huge fan of. I think I talked about Murder Party last episode, or maybe it was 2 episodes ago, which is his first feature film, and I had never seen it before, and I liked it, but it wasn't quite what I expected, and this movie was kind of the same way. I liked it, but it wasn't quite what I expected it to be. It's definitely a super, super slow burn. I was reading some user reviews on, I think it was IMDb, after I watched this movie, and one person said, this was 2 hours I will never get back. And I don't know if it's that strong. Maybe you expected it to be more action-packed, but I appreciate it for what it was. I probably will never watch it again. It just wasn't quite what I wanted it to be, because Blue Ruin and Green Room are super, super intense, and this movie was definitely much more of a slow burn. You do get some pretty intense kills in this movie, and that's kind of why I'm counting it, because it almost kind of turns into a bit of a slasher film towards the end of the movie, so I'm kind of counting on that as far as me being able to count it as a Shocktober viewing. But all in all, I don't want to say that I was disappointed, because it's a solid film, but if you go into it thinking like the IMDb user, I'm assuming, thought that it's going to be like this action-packed movie like Green Room was, then I think you're definitely going to be disappointed with Hold the Dark. And then the last movie that I'm going to talk about, again, I saw Halloween twice, which we'll save that for the review later. I went and saw Goosebumps 2 with my wife, which is a movie that you saw a while back, and you talked about it and you kind of trashed it. And I mentioned when you talked about it that we were planning on going to see it, and we went and saw it. And honestly, like 30 minutes into this movie, I was like, why even bother making a sequel to the first one? Like, the first one was surprising. We're both big Goosebumps fans, and I was telling my wife as we were driving home from seeing this movie, like, I learned how to read reading Goosebumps books. Like, that's just, I read them so much, and I really loved that first movie. Just, it was so much fun, and it had so much charm to it, and they got rid of all of that with the sequel. Like, it felt like the studio was literally, while they were making this movie, they were literally holding a gun to the director's head. Like, you have to make this movie or we're going to murder you right now. Like, it just felt like it was so just by the book. Like, just like, oh, we have to make this sequel, so we're just gonna do every, like, horror cliche, stupid sequel cliche that you could possibly make. It felt like a made-for-TV movie, but it got a theatrical release. Like, everything about this movie was bad. Like, the fat kid from It, which you called him that, and I probably should have wrote down his actual name. Like, he was really good in It. I mean, he didn't blow me away by any means. He's not one of the feature characters necessarily in that movie, but he was really good in that movie, and he was fucking awful in this movie. His teenage sister was really bad. Like, everybody was bad in this movie. There's a scene towards the end with the mom. Like, there's like this twist at the end with the mom, and I was just like, this is the dumbest thing that I think I've seen in a long time in movies. It was so bad. It was funny because, it so happened that I happened to have the TV on, I think it was CBS, right before we were leaving, and as I was just kind of like getting ready for like background noise, and they showed this cartoon called Michael Jackson's Halloween. And it was so bad. It was so bad. And we were actually arguing as we were driving home which movie was worse. Michael Jackson's Halloween or Goosebumps 2. And it's hard. Like, you should look up Michael Jackson's Halloween. It's so bad. It's just awful. I don't know how they got some of the people to do the voices in that movie, but Goosebumps 2 felt so, I mean, it was a sequel for sequel's sake. I don't understand, if you're gonna make a movie this bad, why even bother?
Money. But yeah, 100%.
I mean, it's not even making that much money though.
Well, the first one made money, and that's the thing. But the first one was interesting and unique and had Jack Black, and yeah, I don't know. I said my piece about it last week, but you're right. They completely stripped it of all its charisma. So.
Yeah, for sure. And it also bothers me, and obviously neither one of us are suggesting to go see this film, so it's a bit of a spoiler, but you kind of see it in the first trailer. So he has this book that he hasn't finished writing, and it's supposed to be like his worst story, and it's locked away. Why, when you moved, why wouldn't you take it with you? Like, why would you leave that behind? It just makes zero sense.
Yeah, especially after how protective he was in the first movie over all his stories, because he didn't want them to get out and stuff. And he's oh shit, sure. I forgot the worst one.
Yeah, it's dumb. So stupid. It's so stupid.
Yeah, for sure, man.
All right, so our next segment is just plainly called Comics. Tyler and I read a ton of comics each week, and we like to spotlight one or two an episode. So what'd you read this week?
So I've got to do my periodic check-in of the ongoing Batman series, which I do every so often, typically when an arc ends. And in Batman 57, a small piece of the overarching arc ended that involved KG Beast, so I wanted to talk about that. So this last arc of Batman has been about pushing the Dark Knight further and further into grief to see how he will react. And honestly, I'm not completely sure what to think about the conclusion of issue 57. So I don't want to spoil too much here, but I will say it's hard to have a conversation about anything of substance without getting into a few plot points. So I'm assuming, Pat, that you're not caught up.
No, I haven't even read The Wedding yet.
Oh, so fuck you then anyways.
Yeah, no.
So,
I'm totally cool with it. It's totally my fault.
yeah, so I'm gonna spoil a few things here. And honestly, like, if you even went to comicbook.com this week, they're terrible about...
Yeah, I stay away from them for the most part now.
Yeah, they spoil things in the headlines all the time. So they did that with this issue, but needless to say, like I've previously established, Batman has been in grief since his engagement to Catwoman fell apart, and Dick Grayson basically comes to the rescue to try to cheer the guy up. And the two issues with Dick Grayson, I think it's 54 and 55, are really good, and they explore the relationship between Batman and Robin, and there's a lot of sentiment that pulls on your heartstrings. But at the end of that issue, something terrible happens that basically sets Batman off on this mission that concludes in issue 57, which is obviously what I'm talking about. And although it's just a part, like I was saying, of bigger things that are happening in this comic right now, it does play a pretty crucial part in diving into Batman's psyche. So, with that being said, Batman is up against KG Beast in this issue, and this issue is predominantly a fight in the middle of nowhere Russia between the two in freezing weather, surrounded by snow. Batman's obviously pissed off, and you can probably guess why, but given all the things he has been through as of late, he uses, I guess what you would say are extreme measures, and spoiler alert, he ends up breaking KG Beast's neck. And KG Beast then asks Batman to get help and promises to tell Batman who hired him, but Batman has the most badass response I think that I've ever seen in a Batman comic, which is, "I'm the world's greatest detective. I'll find out who hired you and I'll break them too." Which is a fucking player move, if I do say so myself. So even though that's incredibly badass and it's a great Batman moment, the end of the issue suffers from a Batman Begins problem, which is along the lines of, I don't have to kill you, but I don't have to save you, which of course goes against everything that Batman stands for and has always been kind of like a controversial thing with fans. So with that being said, given the circumstances of what Batman has been through, I can kind of understand his lapse in judgment, and that Tom King is trying to dive into this aspect of Batman's personality and his heroics. And, you know, at the end of the day, Batman is human and he can make mistakes. But I'm definitely curious how Tom King is going to continue to explore the story he's built for The Dark Knight, because so far, all 57 of his issues have been amazing. So I'm definitely intrigued to see what happens next and what happens with KG Beast and if Batman has a change of heart.
Yeah, that's always something that I find interesting, like oh, well, I didn't actually kill you. I just chose not to save you. And that fine line between heroes and villains. I just find that interesting. And when it's done really well, it really kind of can hit home, pretty well. But when it's done poorly, obviously, it's not as great. But yeah, I am always interested in those types of stories.
For sure, man. So what did you read this week?
Well, kind of going with the Shocktober theme, and I feel like I've been doing this a lot lately with like the Venom comic last week, and I try to pick stuff around this time that are more horror related, and they just came out with a new issue of Marvel Zombies, which if you're not aware, it was kind of a what if, like, different universe type of story that they did a few years back. I think I want to say that even Robert Kirkman had something to do with it when it was running a while back, and they just recently, I don't know if this is a one-off story or if it's an actual like series that they're going to be starting again. But this particular book was written by a guy named Maxwell Prince, and the art was done by Stefano Raphael. And honestly, I like the idea. I always think that these types of books are fun. Like when you go into it knowing, obviously, that it's not going to affect the canon of any of these heroes. That it's just that one-off story or the what-if story that the writer and artist can kind of have fun with. I always think that those stories are pretty interesting. But as we've talked about with Walking Dead and various other properties, the zombie genre is very saturated right now. It's not even saturated at this point. There's so much. Like if there's a word for oversaturation, that's what the zombie genre is right now. Like it's beyond saturated at this point. And I felt like with this book, it tried to do the, oh, are zombies really people type of storyline. Like, do they still have some humanity left in them? And we've seen that so much. Like, I mean, even back when the zombie genre started with George Romero and Day of the Dead, like you see that even early on, they tried to examine that type of stuff. And there's one particular zombie, not to spoil too much, but kind of still has some humanity left in him. And there's a bit of a question about whether or not the heroes can use that to their advantage to destroy a horde of zombies. And it's not done horribly in this book. It is kind of cool to see your heroes like Daredevil and Spider-Man fighting zombies. That is pretty cool. But at the same time, like I said, this genre is so oversaturated, and we've seen this type of story done so many times that they don't bring anything new to the table with this book. And it felt like it was kind of rushed towards the end. Like they were just getting to the 30-page mark and they were like, oh fuck, we gotta finish this up. And it just felt really, really rushed. So I would say go ahead and skip this one unless you basically collect everything that's zombie related. I would, definitely just say go ahead and skip this one. It does have its moments where it's kind of fun. Like I said, seeing your heroes fight zombies is pretty cool, but for the most part, the story is pretty lackluster.
Yeah, I saw this came out, and it briefly was on my radar, something I might get, but I don't like... I do like Elseworld Tales, but I don't know that I'm crazy about a zombie version of that, and I know it's been done before, and it's pretty popular, but I'm glad that I skipped it because it sounds pretty skippable. So,
yeah, for sure.
All right. So up next is our segment Nerd News, where we just kind of talk about some of the bigger nerd headlines since the last time we spoke. And we're going a bit long, so luckily I only have 2 stories this week. And yeah, we'll just jump into them. So the first is a trailer that I didn't even know had come out until I saw Halloween, and that's Happy Death Day to You. Did you see the trailer for this?
Yeah, I saw Halloween twice, so yeah.
I didn't, it's one of those trailers that you assume is attached to every copy of Halloween, but you don't know. So I knew that, obviously they, released the title of this movie a few weeks ago, and then they released the first poster for it, but like I said, I wasn't aware that a new trailer had come out till I was sitting there watching Halloween, and you can go back and listen to our episodes around the time of the release of the first Happy Death Day, and both of us like that movie quite a bit. I've talked about it for Shocktober this year. I rewatched it. I don't know, man. The trailer for this movie, I think that the actress, I forget her name, I think that she's pretty charming and she can carry a film, and I'm excited that she's back for it. But besides that, it looks like it's getting a little too convoluted for me.
Yeah, and that's saying a lot, considering that movie was already kind of convoluted. I think they did the Groundhog Day thing as simple as you possibly could, but that concept is so interesting and so convoluted to begin with that it's kind of hard to do a simple version of that. But honestly, I kind of think I had a different reaction to the trailer. I think, first of all, I thought I wasn't a fan that they were making a sequel. Like, it makes sense because we've talked about this before plenty of times that horror movies, it's easy to make a sequel because a lot of these movies are made pretty cheap. So the threshold that you have to hit to make your money back and kind of deserve a sequel is pretty low. So it doesn't surprise me that they made a sequel to this movie, but I wasn't very happy with it. And then just judging by the trailer, yes, it is a little bit more convoluted, and it does seem that they're trying to bring in her friends that are in the first movie into the fray, and I'm a little bit anxious to see if that's going to work. But it does seem to kind of have the charm of the first movie, unlike Goosebumps, like we just talked about, didn't seem to have the charm of the first movie. At least this movie, even though it has a really shitty title, like I cannot get over how shitty of a title that is. But yeah, it definitely does seem to kind of have that loose, like kind of campy feel to it, like the first one did.
Yeah, I agree. Like the feel of the first one is definitely still there, which was what gives me hope for this movie. I'm just saying, I can't tell you what this movie's about after watching the trailer. Like, is it about her being stuck? Is it about her friends being stuck? Why do they go back to the same day after that day has passed? Like, and maybe that's part of it, is you're supposed to have all of these questions and those are going to be answered in the movie, but it was just a lot crammed into a 2-minute trailer. So I'm sure we'll review it come April, but that trailer's out there if you want to give it a watch. So the other story, probably pretty obvious what this story is. The Bohemian Rhapsody movie comes out in 2 weeks, and it's interesting because this weekend another one bit the dust. Luke Cage has been canceled.
That was such a long way to get to that stupid show.
Yeah. I'm not super proud of it, but it's out there now in the world and people are going to hear it. So, Luke Cage. No more Luke Cage for us. It's been canceled alongside Iron Fist. And I think when Iron Fist got canceled, we talked about it. It made sense because no one really liked that show and it wasn't very good. Luke Cage, on the other hand, is pretty much, I mean, I know we gave it a lukewarm review whenever we reviewed season 2, but it's pretty much universally loved. And I want to say at the time of season 1, it was like Netflix's most watched show. It broke Netflix whenever it released. So with that being said, it doesn't seem to me like they're canceling these shows because people aren't watching them. I think that there's something else going on between Marvel and Disney, and obviously their streaming site being started up next year. I just don't think that it's Netflix saying we're not going to do this anymore because it's not getting enough people to watch it. Although, I mean, we've said it a bunch of times, these shows are declining in quality.
So there's a couple of things that I want to hit on. First of all, it wouldn't surprise me if they just outright canceled them, because the endings of season 2 of both shows end on such a weird note that maybe they're trying to get away from it, so to speak. But also I've seen a theory online that they're canceling these shows because they're going to bring them back as heroes for hire. Like, they're getting rid of Iron Fist and they're getting rid of Luke Cage as a solo series, and then they're going to bring them together in a Heroes for Hire series, and that's going to pick up where those two shows left off, which would be very, very cool. I would like that a lot. That's kind of what I wanted from these shows to begin with, and I never really kind of wanted to get to that, and so I'm curious to see if that's the route that they're going, or maybe they're just canceling all of these shows. It seems like if they were going to do that, then they would have canceled all of them altogether and just been like, Netflix is no longer in the Marvel business now with the Disney streaming service. Like, so if that was the case, why wait a week, essentially, or 2 weeks, or however long it was, to cancel Luke Cage after you canceled Iron Fist? Like, I don't know how this happens. Like, I don't know the meetings and the discussions that have to be involved in canceling a show like this, but it seems like if they were going to cancel all of them, they wouldn't wait, like, in between. Like, I know a lot of people are freaking out because they think Jessica Jones is the next one on the chopping block, but honestly, the more I think about it, the more I think the Heroes for Hire thing is probably the route that they're going, because these shows, despite declining in quality, and I know Netflix doesn't release their ratings, but it seems like these shows are still pretty successful. So why would you cancel them unless you're planning on doing something like Heroes for Hire? Or maybe what you said is correct. Maybe Disney is trying to pull all of their stuff. We know that they're pulling their movies, and we know that they're making original content for their own streaming service. So maybe they're trying to get out of the Marvel business because Disney is going to try to make their own stuff on their streaming service. We don't really know. Time will tell, but I'm really kind of keeping my fingers crossed that the Heroes for Hire thing is the way that they're going.
I just don't know why you'd go out of your way to cancel 2 shows to announce another. Unless they're, like, honestly just toying with us and that's going to be the end game. But to go out of your way and say, like, we're not making any more Luke Cage and we're not making any more Iron Fist just to be like, psych! Heroes for Hire doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I do think that obviously they didn't cancel Daredevil yet because season 3 just released this weekend, and Punisher has a new season coming out that's already finished in early 2019. And then Jessica Jones, I know that they were in production on the 3rd season of that show, so I don't know how far in they are, whether it's worth the money to pull the plug now or to continue forward with it. But I guess we'll see. It's interesting none the least, because I don't think Iron Fist was surprising, but Luke Cage is, so. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But that's all I have for nerd news.
All right. So like we've been teasing a couple of times earlier in this episode, we are going to be reviewing Halloween. This is the part of each episode where we kind of just talk about our main topic. We review a lot of things like movies and TV. And like I just said, we're going to be reviewing the new Halloween sequel that's titled just Halloween, which is, let's just say right off the bat, it's stupid that we already have so many movies that are named Halloween now. Like you have the original, and then you have the Rob Zombie movie, and now you have this one. It's kind of hard to keep track of it. Especially if you like search for this movie on IMDb, you have to like pay attention to which one you select. It's super, super annoying, but that's beside the point. This movie was directed by David Gordon Green, who did Pineapple Express. He also did Vice Principals, which is a really funny show on HBO. He wrote it with his writing partner, Danny McBride. And this movie takes place 40 years after the original attack. Laurie Strode has been training, waiting for the day that Michael Myers escapes and comes looking for her. So we say this a lot on the podcast when we're kind of introducing the segments. We always say, like, if this is your first episode, this is what we do on the podcast. And judging by our first segment, it should be pretty clear that we're both big horror fans. Tyler has already talked about the original Halloween being his favorite horror movie, and I'm sure that if he made a top 100 favorite movies of all time, that Halloween, being a big horror fan that he is, Halloween would definitely crack that for him, and it's definitely going to crack it for me. I'm currently trying to make my way through making my top 100 favorite films of all time, and Halloween is definitely one of the ones that I put on that list that I'm just like, this is definitely going to make it. And so I say all of that to kind of tell you that obviously we are both pretty excited for this movie, but I was honestly a little reserved going into this movie. Like I wasn't as excited as I would be for like Avengers or something like that, even though that's kind of as big of a deal for me. This movie is as big of a deal as one of those movies is. It's just that we've seen so many of these movies. We saw the Rob Zombie movies that I have defended in the past. Not the second one. The second one's straight up garbage. But I've defended the first one in the past. But the more I watch it, the more I kind of getting closer and closer to Tyler on that. But we've just seen so many sequels and so many attempted reboots of this franchise that, yes, I was excited because I really, really like this movie and really like the trailer for the new sequel. But I don't know. I've seen so many attempts at trying to remake or kind of revitalize this franchise that I was a little bit reserved going into it.
Yeah. So, I mean, this was the most excited I've been for a movie since Avengers in May. So, for sure, I was looking forward to this, and I mean, like I said earlier in the podcast, and like you pointed out, Halloween is my favorite horror movie of all time. I remember watching it on VHS in grade school, and it just sticking with me and being something that I've loved since then. I will say, like, from a reservations standpoint, I mean, I did have those as well. You mentioned the Rob Zombie Halloween. I remember being so excited for Rob Zombie's Halloween movie. Like, I followed the guy on MySpace, and he was posting stuff like production stuff from the movie, and I was just so pumped for that. And obviously, like you insinuated, I hate that movie. That movie's garbage, and I hated that when I saw it for the first time. So to be let down like that and then get your hopes up for a movie like this, you know, a decade later, like I think that those reservations stick with you. Obviously, the saving grace here is that John Carpenter was involved in a sound capacity, and Jamie Lee Curtis was, of course, involved as well. So I think my reservations more so came from the standpoint that they were ignoring all of the Halloween sequels, which was interesting to me because I do like Halloween 2. And I mean, I like some of the other sequels as well, and I like Halloween H2O, but I could see ignoring some of those. But Halloween 2, obviously John Carpenter still wrote, he didn't direct it, but he wrote it, and I feel like it carries on the legacy pretty well. So to ignore that movie as well was ballsy in my opinion, and, you know, taking away the family connection of Michael and Laurie, I thought was interesting. So I definitely had some reservations, but like I said, I was also super excited.
Yeah, for sure. And it sounds like we're pretty, at least going into the movie, we're pretty similar. Obviously, we haven't discussed our feelings on the movie just yet. We like to keep that for our reviews. So let's just jump right into it. Again, if this is your first episode, we break down these reviews, these main topics into segments, just like we break down the overall episode. And we like to start off after we do our little intro. We like to start off with a general overview. We call it broad strokes. So how do you feel about this iteration of Halloween?
So just a forewarning, I'm going to suck this movie's dick so hard during this review. And I think that it's a movie that may decline in quality the more I watch it, but right now, like, I'm riding pretty high on it, so I hope that that's not the case. Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's amazing. This movie proves that the slasher genre is not played out, it's not tired, and it doesn't always have to be cheesy when following certain tropes. I think that it proves that if you handle the material seriously and you hire the right people and you add in a little love and respect, you can make a truly great film that uplifts the genre. This movie is not perfect by any means, but it's definitely the best Halloween movie since the original two, that I was referencing earlier. And it was done so by respecting what came before it while honoring the genre. And I was elated that this movie was good and so perfectly captured the tone of the series.
Yeah, so I am also going to, as you put it, suck this movie's dick. I saw it twice, like I've mentioned a couple of times. Obviously, I had bought the tickets ahead of time. So I bought my Thursday night tickets, and then I saw that there was a 3:45 showing, and that's like right the perfect time as I get off work that I can get to the theater and sit down and the movie will be starting. So I was pretty psyched about that. So I had already gotten my Friday afternoon ticket before I'd seen the movie, but obviously I would have just canceled it if I didn't want to watch it again. So obviously I really enjoyed this movie too. And I kind of have the same reservations that you do though about loving this movie as much as I love it right now, because I kind of felt the same way about the Rob Zombie Halloween. And I pretty much have gotten to the point where I can't stand to watch that movie. So I'm really afraid that it's going to be that again, because I love this franchise so much that I want to love it. I mean, I even liked the Nightmare on Elm Street reboot a while back. Like, I really liked that the first time I saw it, and I really liked the Friday the 13th reboot too. And those movies have definitely declined in quality as I've watched them in future viewings. So I'm trying to stay somewhat grounded when I talk about this movie, but I think this movie is light years above those movies, like just in quality and just content, what they were trying to do. Like they weren't trying to make your stereotypical slasher movie. And that's the thing that really blew me away and why I think that this movie is going to have so much more staying power than those movies. Because the more we know about PTSD, the more films have been trying to tackle it with varied results, for sure, to say the least. And honestly, you would think that more horror films would try to, but it seems like as a genre, horror films are kind of behind the curve. as far as dealing with PTSD. There are certain movies that do try to tackle it. I mean, Scream, I guess in a way, because she's dealing with her mom's killing in a way. So, I mean, that was kind of the first one that popped into my head. But when you have slasher films and you have these final girls and you give them a sequel, like they survived the first movie and they get a sequel, you would think that there'd be some effect on their personality. And what I really loved about this movie and why I think that it will continue to be good the more you watch it is the fact that this movie really tackled those issues. And it wasn't just Laurie's issues, but how those issues have affected her relationships throughout the years. I think they did a really phenomenal job tackling those issues. And that's why I think that this movie is going to be good the more and more you watch it.
Awesome.
All right, so let's just jump right into the story. How'd you feel about Halloween?
Yeah, so I mean, as I've already established, I love this movie and I love the story of this movie. It's the perfect balance of all the plot points that I wanted to see. We get to see Michael Myers in the institution and dive into his psyche a little bit. We get to see him lurk and kill in a suburban setting that is very reminiscent of the first movie. And then we get to see a final showdown between him and a no longer scared Laurie Strode. It's pretty much the perfect mashup of everything I wanted this movie to be. And the story beats are all what makes my Halloween fanboy squeal with excitement. Like it was very well put together. With all of these great things being said, this movie's not perfect from a story standpoint, but I think that that's kind of also why I find it so endearing. I don't think if you're a person that doesn't like slasher movies or you don't like the Halloween franchise, this movie is by no means going to change your mind. There are some plot points that don't make a ton of sense. For example, how a serial killer in his 60s that has been in a mental institution for 40 years can move and kill like he does. But at the end of the day, for those of us that love Halloween and love the original and love the franchise, this is the perfect spiritual sequel to what I consider to be obviously the best horror movie of all time, my favorite movie of horror movie of all time. So it just hits all the right beats. But like I said, I don't think that it's going to convert anybody.
Yeah, so like I said in the intro, we have seen a lot of these sequels and remakes with the Rob Zombie movies, and this movie basically ignores all of them. It's a direct sequel to the original, and I was kind of a little nervous at the beginning because a lot of times when you have these sequels or reboots or whatever that want to kind of retcon some sequels, those films take too much time, like explaining why those other movies don't matter. And what I really liked, and I was kind of able to relax a little bit with the beginning of this movie, as it didn't seem like it cared too much, spending too much time retconning anything. It does have that little jab at the beginning when they're kind of walking at the very beginning of the movie, and the teenagers are kind of just chit-chatting about how Laurie isn't actually related to Michael Myers. And so I thought that was kind of fun. But you see that in the trailer, so that's not too much of a spoiler. And I love that the reporters that kind of feed us the exposition are podcasters. Just personally, I thought that was kind of cool. I think that the podcasting has become more and more mainstream. So I like that podcasting, it plays a little bit of a role in this movie, because the more we see podcasters in the mainstream movies and stuff like that, the more I think the less I will get the question, like when I tell people about our podcast, well, what radio station are you on? Like those stupid fucking questions. So I'm always happy the more podcasting has kind of seeped into the mainstream. But like I said, in broad strokes, I really loved the PTSD stuff. Not just with Laurie, because I think that would be kind of the easy route. Like, obviously she went through this traumatic thing when she was younger, so she would have some residual PTSD kind of stuff. But I loved how much it affected her relationships with her other members of her family. Like they talk about how she was divorced twice. She had this daughter that was taken away from her because of the way that she raised her. And that plays a huge role later in the film. And so I love that not only did they tackle the PTSD stuff with Laurie, which would again be kind of surface level, easy kind of stuff to do, but they also dug a little bit deeper. And what I think makes this movie so good is how that affected the people around her, which I thought was really interesting. I will say that there is a moment in this movie where there's a conversation between a policeman and the doctor, basically the new Loomis, as they call him in this movie. And they kind of explain it a little bit. And I didn't really particularly like that scene that much because I've said this in past, like, if you're doing a good enough job as a filmmaker, you should trust that we're going to get all of these little nuances that you're putting into the movie. Like, as the audience, we're smart enough to pick up on those things, I think, from the most part. And I don't like scenes like that where they're almost kind of feeding us that, like spoon feeding us that stuff. And so I was kind of a little, like, for me, I was a little bit annoyed with that scene, but it doesn't last very long. And it's basically the only moment in the movie where they do that. So I'll give them a pass for that. I will say that I loved that they didn't spend too much time explaining Michael's motives. Like, that's a big part of the Rob Zombie Halloween movies that most people shit on, and I have come to be very annoyed with, because in the first movie, that's his thing. Like, he's just pure evil. There's no reason for why he does this other than the fact that he is just the boogeyman. Like, he's just an evil dude. So the fact that they don't spend too much time explaining his motives at all, you know what's going to happen in this movie. Like, you know that he's going to escape eventually and that he's going to come after Laurie. That's just what he's going to do. And so the fact that they don't spend too much time over explaining or really explaining at all his motives, I really appreciate it. I will say that I read somewhere that the original cut of this movie was over 2 hours long. So maybe there's a little bit more of that in that original cut, but I'm glad that they cut out some of that fat in the final cut, because I thought that it definitely made the movie move a lot quicker than maybe it would have in the original cut. And then once you get to Laurie's house at the third act, it's just so amazing. It's basically a doomsday prepper's wet dream. And I thought that was it was so well crafted, because obviously if you're going to be this badass bitch that Laurie Strode becomes, like, her house would be decked out, and I love that about it. And it's done in a way that kind of works in the horror genre, because there's a character that eventually gets to her house and she's kind of like in the backyard, and there's like this shooting range, and it's kind of creepy. Like, that scene is kind of creepy. And so I definitely think that the filmmakers did that on purpose and really tried to make that play to the horror genre. So I definitely appreciate that. And I don't know about you, Tyler, but there is a little bit that I would like to talk about later that maybe we could put like an extra show note in there for a spoiler section. I just want to get your opinion on something that I think is a little too spoilery. So if you're cool with that, I think that we can kind of have a second story discussion here in a little bit.
I'm editing this week, and that sounds like more work. So no, I'm not cool with that. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, that's fine.
All right, so we're going to jump into performances and then do action, and then we'll talk about the little bit that I want to talk about so we'll have like a part 2 of the story discussion. So as far as performances, how'd you feel about Halloween?
I think that the main actors are all pretty great in this movie. Like, Jamie Lee Curtis is amazing. She's been amazing for 40 years. I love Judy Greer, so I think that she's great in this movie. They introduce an actress named Andi Matichak, maybe, that plays Allison, who I think is great. And then from there, you kind of get into the side characters, and those are hit or miss, for sure. Like, especially some of Allison's classmates that, spoiler alert, bite the bullet and get killed. But I think that that's also part of the charm, to me, is, you know, the actors alongside Jamie Lee Curtis were not great in the original Halloween movie, and they were there to serve one purpose, which is to get murdered by Michael Myers. And so, even though, you know, we live in this day of age where everybody needs to put out a great performance. I do think that, I like that the trope of that genre was still kind of present, whether it was purposeful or not, and that some of the high school kids that, end up with their necks sliced or stabbed, aren't great actors or actresses.
Yeah, and that's kind of the point, I think. Like, Jamie Lee Curtis wasn't well known when she got this. I don't know if this was her first role as an actress or not, or maybe she was in a few things here and there, but it was definitely her first starring role. Like, she was unknown at the time, and so for them to cast I'm assuming, I've never seen her before in anything. I don't know if she's popped up here and there in other things, but basically an unknown actress for her granddaughter. I thought that was kind of a perfect little nod to the original, so I definitely appreciated that. I love Jamie Lee Curtis in this movie. I thought she played the badass grandma so well. Like, this is not something that we talked about much in story, but the fact that they could have easily made her like this sad person, like super scared all the time. And she is scared. I mean, there is some PTSD stuff that we talk about earlier in the review. But she's such a badass in this movie, and I think she plays that so well. But not just that, there are some emotional moments earlier in the movie and kind of sprinkled throughout, and I think she does a phenomenal job. This is probably her best performance that I've seen her in a long time, and so I definitely appreciate that. Judy Greer, I'm just a huge fan of her. I don't know why. Like, she just pops up in movies here and there, but she always does a really good job, and I think she's phenomenal in this movie as well. The granddaughter she's alright. Like I said, she's kind of a little known actress, so I think she does alright. I liked that she's not the main person in this movie. Like, they don't, make her, like, again, going kind of back to what I said in the story, where they don't really explain Michael's motives too much. I like that that she's not his main target. And so I definitely appreciate that. She kind of has this little side story, and she kind of gets forgotten, towards like the beginning of the third act. She's kind of on her own, and she doesn't really play much of a part, but she's alright. And again, kind of going back to what you said, the high school students aren't good in this movie at all. And again, kind of the point, like, they're not going to be good. So yeah, they kind of play it up within the genre. It's kind of, I don't want to say meta, because I don't know if they necessarily did it on purpose, but it's definitely a trope of horror movies that the acting is not going to be very good. So, I definitely appreciate that, and I think that's about it. The dad doesn't really play much of a role, and I think he was alright, but he's barely in it, and I think that's pretty much it. I thought the doctor was a little too much Loomis for me, but I mean, I guess that's kind of the point. His accent was a little annoying to me, but other than that, I think everybody did a really good job.
Cool.
Alright, so as far as action, how'd you feel about Halloween?
Well, I didn't really do action. I did horror, since this is a horror movie, but,
Tomato.
It's not the scariest movie in the world, but it definitely feels like a genuine sequel to the 1978 movie. It does step up, like, the violence and the gore and the intensity compared to that movie, because obviously we're 40 years later here. But is this movie's horror going to give me nightmares? No, absolutely not. But for me, I think that this movie is definitely now a staple of the season, and I definitely appreciate the horror elements that they were able to put in this movie to make it respectful of the past, but also feel like a movie that's made in 2018.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I was impressed that there wasn't too many, like, jump scare type of moments, which I definitely appreciate. There was one where Judy Greer's character comes home, and she kind of suspects that there's somebody there, and her husband comes through the back door, and that's the closest I would say to kind of one of those gotcha jump scare moments. And so I was appreciative that they didn't really go that route much of this movie. I will say that I don't want to say disappointed, because I was actually thought that it was kind of clever filmmaking, but you do see him brutally kill a couple of people, but for the most part, I think that this movie was a little tame. Like, the Rob Zombie Halloween movies are super intense. Not to say that this movie isn't intense, because you see some really gruesome, like, dead bodies in this movie, but you honestly don't see him actually kill that many people. Like, they kind of cut to where you see him, like, holding the knife, and then they kind of have that sound effect like he's stabbing them, but you don't actually see the knife go into the body very often. There's a couple of scenes there's one scene in particular where he kills this old woman with a hammer, but you don't actually see him. You see the woman kind of walk away, and then you see him follow her, and then you hear the sound effect of him killing her, but you don't actually see it. And you see that a couple of times. Like, he kills one of the granddaughters, and I keep calling her granddaughter because I don't remember her name in the movie. Allison. You don't see him kill her two friends at all. Like, you kind of see him drag this one away, and then you see the kid go up the stairs to kind of like save her, and then you see his dead body later, but you don't actually see him die. And I think that's actually kind of fun. Like, it makes for the few times that you actually do see him kill somebody, it makes it like worthwhile, I think, because again, kind of going back to what I said with the ritual, if you see the monster too much, and in this case, if you see Michael kill somebody too much, I think it kind of takes the power away from it. And so I definitely appreciate that. And I will say, and this is not really action or horror, but that tracking shot where he's walking, where the kids are trick-or-treating, and he's walking, and then right before he kills that woman, fucking, oh my god, I had a film nerd boner that whole time. It's such an amazing shot. And then later in that scene, you see him walking to get into somebody's house. You see the woman on the phone, and you kind of see his shadow along the fence line. Man, it was so cool. Like, it's such a cool way to do that. So I just, like, a film nerd, as a film nerd, I just had a boner that whole time. So it was fantastic.
Yeah, man, I agree.
All right, so star rating. How'd you feel? Well, do you want to do the star rating, or do you want to do the spoiler section first?
Let's do the star rating so that the people that don't want to know can turn it off, because nobody listens to Nerd Favorite anyways. So I don't know if that's true, but let's do a star rating. Then we'll have our spoiler conversation so that people can I'll still put a show note in, but if people want to just turn it off after they know what we give it from a star rating standpoint, they can.
Sounds good. So Halloween.
I'm struggling with this because my heart says 4.5, but my brain says 4. But, I mean, 'tis the season, so I'm going to go with 4.5 with the caveat that this could go down over time.
Yeah, I was kind of having the same struggle. I think we think too much about our star ratings, to be honest. Like, I think, like, future-wise, it will probably be a 4-star for me. And so I kind of went back and forth, like I said earlier, with Rob Zombie's Halloween. Like, I fucking loved that movie when I first saw it. And then, obviously, now it's almost to the point where I can't watch it. Cause the hospital scene, like, that shit drags on for so long. It's so ridiculous. So, yeah, I'm trying to stay a little bit grounded, so I'm gonna go with a 4. But man, after I saw it that first time, I was like, man, this is going to be my favorite movie of the year. Like, I wanted to give it 5 stars. Like, that's how jacked I was. And I'm not saying that it dampered the second time I saw it, but obviously you're not going to be as excited the second time you see a movie, no matter how excited you were the first time. But yeah, I'm definitely going to go with 4, but it's definitely in the conversation for my favorite movie this year so far.
Nice, man.
All right, so spoiler section. I don't know if you have anything that you really want to talk about, but there was something that I kind of thought about the first time I saw it, and then the second time I was kind of looking for it, and I have a theory. So they don't really talk about much, and this is something that I really liked about the movie. They don't really spend too much time discussing how Michael escapes, and this is why I didn't want to talk about it in our general review. I wanted to save it for the spoiler section. The doctor helps Michael, but they never explain how the bus actually crashes. And my theory is the doctor really wanted to be on that bus. And so I think that he, at some point, like, kills the bus driver or something to crash it to let Michael out.
Yeah, I thought that was a given. So, I mean, I didn't read too much into it. I got the feeling whenever you first encountered the doctor on the bus that maybe something sinister was going on there. And then, of course, later that comes to fruition and he's revealed to be a not so great guy. So, yes, that's what I assume as well.
Okay, cool. I just wanted to pass that along. Like, I think that I think that the movie does a really good job of kind of leaving it open-ended. But the more I watch it, like, the more I thought about it, I was like, he had to, because they don't ever say anything about the bus crash. Like, he tells the story to the sheriff or whatever, but he never makes it really clear what happens.
Yeah. I mean, you could blame it on all sorts of stuff. I mean, it was a bus full of crazy people, so any one of them could have caused the wreck. So, with that being said, you know, you mentioned, do I have anything spoiler related I want to talk about? So there's two things, and I feel bad. Well, the first one is just a question, but the second one I'll start with actually is, you know, I just gave this movie a glowing review, but there was one thing that sat with me a little bit as not making a lot of sense. And that is whenever Michael and Allison are locked in the back of the police car together.
Yes.
Why he kills the doctor before killing her. Because it was a lot harder for him to kill that doctor by, you know, kicking through the grate, where he could have just strangled Allison right there and then turned his attention to the doctor, which seems like it would make more sense in his, you know, deranged mind.
So my theory on that and kind of my thoughts is, so you see earlier in the movie where they had the podcasters and they're at the gas station, and it felt like he was kind of playing with her a little bit.
Yeah.
And I wonder if he was kind of doing the same thing with Allison at that moment. Like, his first thought was to kill the doctor, probably because he hates the doctor. Like, I mean, I'd imagine that you would hate that guy. So maybe his first thought was, I have to kill this guy. And he wanted to do it as brutal as physically possible. And then maybe he was just playing with her. Like, oh, I can get her a little bit later. That sort of thing.
I mean, I'm not going to read too much into it. I just don't think in the moment that makes a lot of sense. But the other thing I wanted to get your opinion on was, like, he straight up kills a kid in this movie with his bare hands, which I thought was, I don't want to say like killing a kid is cool, because obviously it's not, but I appreciate that he does not shy away from who he kills, and that's pretty much established when he murders that child. But there's a scene. He
didn't kill that baby.
Yeah, exactly. That's where I was going. In that tracking shot, he walks past the baby, and I was like, holy shit, he's gonna murder a baby in this movie, and he doesn't. So why do you think they even include the baby in that tracking shot? Like, what's the point in establishing that he won't kill a baby, but he'll kill a kid? Like, what, does he start killing at age 10? Like, what's his cutoff?
Puberty, for sure.
Okay.
Once your balls drop, he's gonna murder you. No, honestly, to tackle the first thing that you said, I loved it. I love that he killed that kid, which is a weird thing to say. Please don't, like, cut that out and, like, just, that'd be so weird. Like, that.
Dude, that's gonna be the opening of this episode. If it wasn't
it's so cool that he killed that kid.
If it wasn't too spoilery, I would 100% make that the opening of this episode, as you saying, I love that he killed that kid.
My thought process was that you were gonna, like, cut it out and that you were just gonna save that. It's just like, it's so, like, damning of a statement out of context. But anyways, because, and I hate keeping, like, shitting on the Rob Zombie Halloween movie, but the biggest thing for me and a lot of people is the fact that they tried to make him a human character. And in this movie, and in the original movie, he was just the boogeyman. Like, he was just pure evil. And that's what I really loved about that scene, was that he didn't give a shit that it was a kid. Like, I think in other movies that you have these slashers, they let the kid go. But he's Michael Myers. He is the boogeyman. He is pure evil. So why would he let the kid go? He would just murder the kid. That makes sense. Now, the baby thing, that did kind of bother me, because I was like, holy shit, he's going to kill this fucking baby. Like, I thought that that's what was going to happen, because they did establish that with the kid. But I thought that was kind of like a fuck you to Rob Zombie. Because the whole thing with his kid's sister and him holding him at the beginning. And, I kind of thought that was kind of a middle finger to Rob Zombie.
Okay. Well, if that's the case, then I love it. So Cool. So that's what I have spoiler wise.
All right. So if anybody is still listening and wants to hear us do our nerd favorite, it's that time. So hopefully you have returned. And what's nerd favorite this week?
So probably pretty obvious. It's going to be favorite horror sequel. So while you think of an answer, for me, it would obviously probably be one of these movies, these Halloween movies, most notably the one we just reviewed. But obviously I want to keep the conversation fresh. So I'm going to go with a movie. Like, I started thinking about this nerd favorite this morning, and I was like, well, what would be my favorite horror sequel? And I think that there's some obvious answers. I think a lot of people would probably say Aliens, but I know we've established on the podcast before, I consider that more of an action movie than a horror movie. So my actual answer, I think, is going to be Scream 4. And I think that movie got a lot of praise when it came out, and it's kind of faded to the background of the Scream franchise since, but it's a really fucking good movie. And it really kind of re-energized that franchise, even though they didn't do anything else with it after Scream 4, after the shit show that Scream 3 was. I think that there's a lot of cool twists. It kind of does what the Halloween movie we just reviewed does, and it respects the past while introducing kind of a new slew of characters and new high schoolers. And I just think that movie was really well done. And it's nice that Wes Craven was able to end the Scream franchise on a really positive note, before he unfortunately passed away a couple years ago. So for me, it's Scream 4, I think.
Yeah, I like Scream 4 a lot more than I thought I was going to going into it because, like you said, Scream 3 is such a shit show. But, I mean, if I was going to pick a Scream sequel, it'd be the second one. I really like the fourth one, but I think my favorite of that franchise, not favorite overall, obviously the first one is the best one, but I really like the second one just because the first one plays to all the horror tropes and it's very meta, and then the second one kind of shifts its aim to sequels and horror sequels, and so I think that it definitely plays to the first one really well, and it really fits to what they were trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, I was looking at Rotten Tomatoes, and I was surprised at how high the second Scream is. So you're not alone.
Yeah, it's a really good movie.
I've only seen that one a couple times, so I probably need to revisit it. But what's your favorite horror sequel?
So this is kind of cheating because it's not a direct sequel, but anybody that's listened to this podcast or knows me personally, you know that I love George Romero and his Dead movies and Dawn of the Dead. There's always an argument about like which one's better, Night of the Living Dead or Dawn of the Dead, and I definitely think that Night of the Living Dead is better. I think that Dawn of the Dead does drag a little bit, especially there's something that happens in the third act that has nothing to do with zombies that kind of bugs me a little bit. Like, I don't really particularly like it. And I think that I don't want to give Zack Snyder any credit because I think his career has definitely nosedived a lot, but his remake of Dawn of the Dead really works because it kind of took out that little bit. I mean, it works for on many different levels, but it especially works because of that. And I just think that Dawn of the Dead is just such a phenomenal sequel, even though it's not a direct sequel, of course, but, it works on so many levels. Night of the Living Dead, of course, is still better, but Dawn of the Dead will always be my favorite horror sequel.
I've never seen the original Dawn of the Dead. I've only seen the Zack Snyder reboot. Yeah, so I need to watch it. That's embarrassing. Yeah, I need to watch it. It's just one of those movies that I'd never owned on Blu-ray, and I don't know if it's streaming anywhere, so it wasn't like readily available to watch. So I definitely plan to watch it, but I like Zack Snyder's version of it quite a bit. So.
And so I think I talked about this, my first ever podcast I went on was the Obsessive Viewer. They had a zombie themed episode, and obviously I'm a huge fan of the genre, especially way back then before it was just ridiculously saturated. And I kind of talked about, I think that they're not sequels in a traditional sense, but I think that they kind of explore different aspects of the zombie genre, but they look at different time periods in the zombie. Like, Night of the Living Dead, obviously that's the first night that it happens. And then Dawn of the Dead, people have kind of been living with the zombies for a little bit, and you kind of move further and further along. Now, Diary of the Dead kind of breaks that cycle a little bit, but the first few definitely, I feel like, are sequels in that sense.
Yeah, and then by the time you get to Land of the Dead, they're just regular all humans. So
yeah, that wasn't great.
No, not at all. So yeah, man, cool. I'll have to watch Dawn of the Dead for sure.
For sure. All right, so that's it for episode 212 of the Nerds You're Looking For podcast. Of course, we'd appreciate if you subscribe, rate, review us on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, basically any good podcatcher you use. We're on it. You can also check out our website, thenerdspodcast.com. Comment and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Nerds You're Looking For. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram. They're both at The Nerds Podcast. Like us on Facebook. Follow us on Google+. Email us at thenerdsyou'relooking4@gmail.com. And finally, vote for us for Podcast of the Month at podcastland.com. For Patrick Kuhn,
Tyler Hunt.
we are the Nerds You're Looking For. Take it easy, guys.
Later, guys.